taxes were imposed on the colonies, which had actually been standard in England for a long time, especially stamp taxes. You know what a stamp tax is, right? You have to, if you buy a newspaper, legal documents, anything like that, you buy a stamp to put on it. They have been paying stamp taxes for nearly a century in England, so this didn't seem the least bit unreasonable. They could not have anticipated the firestorm that arose from the Americans. What's wrong? You people are Englishmen. You've had a free ride all this time. Can't you just pay a little part of the freight? To Americans, where the hell did this come from? You've never done this before. We have always been on our own. Look, if we have to pay these taxes, we ought to have somebody in Parliament. No taxation without well, hold it. You are represented. What do you mean? We didn't elect anybody. It's often said that Britons and Americans are separated by the same language. Representation, for example. Over here, it meant that if you elected somebody to the legislature, and actually Americans had much more of an opportunity to do that than the average Englishman did. You elected somebody that you knew who lived in the district, who was from that particular area. Frequently in Parliament, people would stand for election in a place where they had never set foot. No, I'm not going to go up there. It's no fun, but there's a seat open, so I'll throw my name in and see if I can get elected with somebody's support. Okay. Every member of Parliament is supposed to represent the whole empire, not just a narrow constituency. In America, that's what it did look like. Burke said, look, I mean, you really need to take account of specific circumstances. The specific circumstances over there, I mean, the Crown keeps talking about the rights of sovereignty. Especially the king. Well, what's interesting, too, is how little each side knew about each other, because the King of England at this time had no power to tax. Who did? It was Parliament. They were the ones who imposed all the unpopular taxes. The king, no more than the President of the United States now, could impose taxes. The rights of sovereignty simply mean, that we have the right to levy taxes. Regulations, all those kinds of things. You are Englishmen. We are your government. We have the right to do these things. Burke said, yes, you're right. You do have the formal right to do that kind of thing. What about the context, though? Do you have the wisdom to go about it possibly differently? And a lot of people said this with Burke. I mean, both sides were kind of scratching their heads, because in Britain they just were stunned. Look, why are you objecting to this? I mean, can't you help your fellow countrymen out here, since they've been carrying the load exclusively? So what are we going to do now? Well, said Burke, you might apply something called the computing principle. The application of general policies or goals to specific circumstances. Yes, you do indeed have the right to levy those taxes. You do have the right to levy those taxes. You have the right to levy those taxes. However, the computing principle says, let's see what the situation on the ground actually is. These guys are accustomed to being on a very loose leash. They've been managing their own affairs time out of mind. That's the way they've always done it. They are unfamiliar with all of this. Might be just wise to enter into some consultation, maybe allow them to elect a few parliamentary MPs or something like that. Of course, Parliament was really feeling the pressure, plus the fact that George III was an eager, young, and thoroughly inexperienced king. He really wanted to show everybody that he was an Englishman, because he was the first of the Georges who spoke English as a native language. The first two did not. They spoke German. They did not speak the language of the country that they were the head of. That was not uncommon at that time. Remember that George I and George II would always do governmental business in French with their ministers. Even though England was the age-old enemy of France, they still used French as the language of business, since that's what the ministers and the king were both able to speak. The average Englishman at the time would not have learned German, nor would a German have bothered to learn English, but they both would have learned French as the international language of business, politics, diplomacy, and everything like that. So the king, I'm going to show people that I'm really an Englishman. Give me a pint of stout and a pork pie. Yes, sir. And what you need is real royal leadership to clean up all this waste, fraud, and mismanagement that Parliament's gotten us into. Of course, that scared some people in Parliament because the King of England at this time was not absolute, not even in theory. The king really had to depend on the support of Parliament. He could not simply appoint anybody he wanted as prime minister. All that was completely unknown to the Americans. Look at it this way. Suppose, back in 2004, there was an interesting news item that made the rounds in North Jersey and New York, when a cop in Carteret saw a car idling out at the curb and it was unattended. He wrote him up. That's a traffic offense. If you leave a car unattended, nobody's in there and the car is running, it's out on the street. Not if it's in a parking lot. If you're going into a convenience store, you can leave your car running. Don't leave a child unattended in either case, but you can leave your car running if it's in a parking lot, but not on the street. Okay. Guy got a ticket. And there was an absolute explosion of outrage because people really hadn't been getting tickets for that for a long, long, long time. It was still the law, but it had not been enforced. And why do you suppose Carteret started doing it all of a sudden? Yeah, it was a way to raise municipal revenues. The government of Carteret was in the hole. They figured, oh boy, here's how we can start writing people up for this. It's the law. Well, it's kind of what the British did with a group of parliamentary regulations called the Navigation Acts. They had been passed by Parliament in 1650, but they really had not been enforced for just about 100 years. And they were just lying there on the books. So what do you think happened when all of a sudden people in everywhere started getting tickets for idle cars? Same thing as, I'm going to go up to Manhattan after this class, and like every other pedestrian, I'm going to break the law. Yeah?
When did you say they started being enforced?
2004. I'm going to break the law up in Manhattan. I'm going to do that. So is every other pedestrian. What are we going to do?
Jail.
Yeah, I'm not supposed to do that. Suppose, Bill de Blasio's really in the red up in New York. He's got big money problems. Suppose he all of a sudden starts to enforce the letter of the law. First of all, how many trillion, gazillion tickets would the police have to issue in about 15 minutes if they tried to ticket everybody who's jaywalking? Because we all cross against the light. We all cross where we're not supposed to. That's against the law, but the law really hasn't been enforced. That's kind of what happened with the Americans. It's kind of what happened with the cops in Carteret. Why do you suppose we have a law like that in New Jersey where you are not allowed to leave a car running at the curb? It goes back to the early 1920s, right after World War I. Yeah. It actually had to do back in that day with bank robberies. What's it got to do with that?
Because they would go around the banks and put a cop in the door.
Yeah, we need to turn on cars, just go.
Yeah, I mean, starting a car in 1920 was a little bit more elaborate process. You had to stick the crank in to get her going. If you leave the car running, then the hold-up men can go into the bank, grab the money, and then run. This way, I mean, if the cops saw a car running, they'd immediately figure, uh-oh, something's, again, this is back in the early 20s. We see a car running, we're going to assume that there's a hold-up in progress. Bank robbers are a bit more sophisticated. They have other ways of doing it. Instead of having the car parked, they have the guy ride around the block, and then when the robbery's complete, they jump in. So, in any case, the law was still on the book. And Carteret decided, how can we get out of the hole? Here's how. A lot of municipalities did that during the crash 10 years ago, too. They were deeply in the hole, so all of a sudden they doubled traffic fines, parking violations, all that kind of stuff. A number of police forces had orders, write them up. That's how we'll get out of this budgetary hole. Because, taxes just aren't doing it. All right, the point is, the computing principle might say, well, wait a minute, hold it. If you're going to start enforcing that law again, maybe you should explain to people that it is the law, that it will be enforced after this particular date. But this kind of came out of the blue. No, there was no announcement or anything. This cop just started writing people up on orders from the municipal government. So when Burke comes to the French Revolution, he's basically applying the same thing, the computing principle. It's one thing to have ideals and goals and policies. It's another thing, how do you go about putting them into practice? It's not enough simply to want to do something. Do you know how to do it? Do you know what obstacles you might run into? What struck him about the leaders of the French Revolution, remember, he's the guy who knew what it was like to run for dog catcher and lose. The leaders of the French Revolution were people who were, you may have heard this term, referred to as philosophes. And they were people who had basically spent their lives in literary societies, philosophical journals. They inhabited a world of ideas. Burke had ideas. I mean, he knew Greek and Latin cold. He could speak French fluently. He probably knew Italian. And he was highly educated. He had a degree from Trinity College up in Dublin. That was the Irish equivalent of Oxford and Cambridge. But he had not simply spent time simply in ideas. It's one thing to have an idea, oh, wouldn't it be so beautiful if everybody were treated justly, et cetera, et cetera. That's an idea. Now, how do you go about doing that? Or everybody would never have to worry about food or medical care. That's an idea. What does it entail to put it into practice? It's not enough simply to want something. Well, but my heart's in the right place. Yes, but how do you actually go about doing that kind of thing? That's the computing principle. Burke was a disciple of the philosopher David Hume. And if you've taken philosophy, you've probably heard his name. His major work was published in 1740 when he was only 29 years old. Anybody ever run into Hume's name in philosophy? He's very, very major philosopher. He actually was also friends with Gibbon, with Burke, and he was one of the boys who hung around the pub all the time, and they'd really go for the beef and ale with two hands, and that's when the conversation got really good. But anyway, Burke was very much impressed, and I hate to give you this term, but I'm going to have to. By Hume's epistemological skepticism. Jeepers creepers. What the hell does that mean? Suffering catfish. cheese and crackers. I'll give you a hint. Epistemology comes from the Greek word episteme, which means to know. Yeah.
Epistemology or epistemological means just knowing what you know, the knowledge of knowing.
It's a major branch of philosophy. That's exactly what it is. It comes from Greek. It means science of knowledge. In other words, how reliable is the knowledge you think you have? Every time you ask somebody, well, how do you know? You're saying, that's what you told me you know. How do you know that you know? So, for example, if you have a job interview up in New York, 11 o'clock on a weekday morning, and your friend says, oh, well, you can get a train from Somerville, leaves at 8:30, and you ask, how do you know? Why do you want that knowledge to be reliable? Yeah, you're depending on, okay, so you get to the train station. Oh, boy, I'm just in time. Oh, the train left 20 minutes ago. Didn't you realize that? We changed the schedule. When's the next one? Oh, about 10 o'clock. Oh, great. No job interview. So in other words, you wanted to be sure that your friend's knowledge was reliable. In this case, it was not. Your friend did not know what he claimed to know. Burke says that this especially applied to the people who were leading the French Revolution because they struck him as cocksure of their intelligence and their knowledge. They had spent all of their lives in books. All of their lives they had spent in books, and they knew little to nothing outside of that. They had never been involved in politics. They had almost no idea of the limits of politics the way Burke did. What they had were great goals like human equality, the end of suffering. They really believed that because they were smart, they could construct a society based purely on abstract ideas, which is completely untested by experience. We've got everything figured out. Hume, as I said, this is his major work. It didn't make much of a hit in his lifetime, although it did impress this guy in Germany by the name of Immanuel Kant. You may have heard something about him. Kant read Hume's book and just kind of said, wow, I have to pay attention to this guy. This is very deeply troubling, because before that, Kant had been absolutely convinced of the infallibility of human reason. It was kind of like the cocksure, optimistic side of the Enlightenment. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that we cannot do using reason. We can reduce all of experience to a mathematical equation. And it's simply a question, building a new society is like building anything else. We will simply use these. French Revolution was built largely on ideas that you might consider a priori. Ever run into that term in logic or in philosophy? What is not a priori knowledge? Yeah.
Isn't just stuff that you already right? Isn't it? I'm trying to articulate it properly, but I've just got like a idea on it.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about like communications class a few weeks ago.
What is a priori knowledge? It's Latin is the expression. It means from before.
Prior.
What kind of knowledge is it? It's knowledge that you don't get. Yeah.
Prior knowledge.
It's prior knowledge, and it's not based on experience. It's based purely on mental process, like 2 + 2 is 4. That's a priori knowledge. It's knowledge that you have strictly by reason alone and no actual experience. So in other words, it's kind of like an assumption that you make about the world and the way it works. The people in France, as far as Burke was concerned, were trying to rebuild society overnight on the basis of a priori assumptions. In other words, we simply know that mankind are good. We simply know that we can reshape society overnight. They might have done well to pay closer attention to the American Revolution. Revolution because I think I mentioned him here before. One of the French philosophes was reading about the American Revolution, and he wrote an essay. He said, look what the Americans have done. Overnight, they have torn down the old order and built something completely new based on reason. And John Adams, the rather grouchy, bald-headed second president of the United States, read this essay and he wrote, "You fool," in the margin. No, that's not what we've done at all. The leaders of the American Revolution were much, much different. They were indeed highly educated, but most of them had spent about 6 or 7 years in the Army. They had been in direct combat. They had run businesses. They also had run for election and lost. So their idea of politics was much, much closer to Burke's than the people who admired them so much in France. Let me ask you this. Does anybody here know anything about building ocean liners? You don't do it like on the weekend, or it'd be a pretty good hobby, don't you think? It just might be a bit difficult around here to find a place to float your boat. But there are people who do know an awful lot about building ocean liners, aren't there? Take, for example, this firm in Belfast called Harland and Wolff, 100 years ago. Built lots of battleships for the British Navy, built battleships for the Japanese Navy. I mean, we've got the money, we've got the technology. And in 1911, 1912, they built a state-of-the-art ocean liner that really attracted enormous international attention. I mean, it was really something to be on the maiden voyage of it. And one of the things that was advertised about this, this is 1912, come on, I mean, we can do just about anything, is that this ship was unsinkable. You might want to say, how do you know? Wouldn't you? You mean, if this ship really, no, can't sink. It's impossible. Well, why can't it? Well, look, if you argued with Harland and Wolff's engineers, wouldn't you probably lose the argument unless you're an engineer yourself? Because they would talk rings around you. But you might still say, well, how do you know? You know a lot more about shipbuilding than I do, and you know an awful lot about engineering. But just how do you know for sure, absolutely, that it's impossible for this ship to sink? Of course, I'm talking about the RMS Titanic, which on her maiden voyage struck an iceberg, which made a slit about 8 inches long at one part of the hull, and that's apparently what sank her, because the water pressure where the slit in the hull occurred was so great. The ship's architect took a tour and said she's not going to stay afloat for more than 2 hours. We better take drastic measures. Of course, didn't have nearly enough lifeboats because it wasn't thought to be necessary. I mean, the ship really can't sink, so we don't have to worry about that kind of thing. Certainly, we know that human error was involved because somebody had not instructed the crew, or at least the guys who were at the wheel when the iceberg was sighted. Because the old way of steering ships was like doing a canoe. If you want to make a right with a canoe, you have to paddle on the left side. If you want to make a right or a left, you paddle on the right. Well, the Titanic's steerage was very much like a modern car. You turn the wheels in the direction that you want to go. These guys, however, saw the iceberg, took evasive action, but they steered the ship right into it because they were unaware of this new system of steerage. So lack of knowledge really hurt big time. Pardon me?
The Titanic.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Yes. But even so, I mean, the engineers would have said, oh, this state of engineering right now is in such an advanced state that this ship is literally unsinkable. Well, of course, she went down, and 2/3 of the passengers on board went down with her. Of course, another thing they didn't have to do at that time was for ships internationally to keep the wireless on around the clock. So the Titanic could not contact anybody by radio until dawn, and of course was at the bottom by then. set off lots of flares and everything, but ships that saw her thought simply that, well, it must be some kind of party going on there, one of those pleasure cruises or something. Hope they're having a good time. Finally, there was an American freighter, the Californian, that responded, but way too late. She got there just to pull survivors out of the water. The thing is, though, it's the same thing as, can you imagine if somebody who goes online, this is where epistemological limitations come into effect. Suppose there's somebody who goes to a program on a computer called How to Drive a Car, right? And studies and studies and studies, and then sees that, there you go right there, Mr. Jones, passes the test, every question. I've taken this program, How to Drive a Car, I'd like my license. You would? What else do you have to do before you qualify for a driver's license?
You have to drive.
Yeah, I mean, there's something, that's the smart part, right? You can answer all the questions. But is there anybody who just has a natural instinct of how to make a left-hand turn? For me, that was a hard thing to learn how to do. In other words, you can only learn from experience. I mean, how many hours do you have to fly, even if you want to do a private plane, before you qualify for a pilot's license? Yeah.
How do you take prodigies into account then? Because there's some people that have talents that I know it's a big, I'm not going to get like nature or nurture thing, but I'm saying I've known people that actually, family or kids that I know, friends of kids who like picked up something one day. They never seen it taught. They just figured it out on their own.
But wouldn't you have to demonstrate that you can make a left before you get a license? Are they going to give it to you simply because you passed the test about driving? Or are they going to say, show us that you can do it?
Oh, absolutely. I thought you were saying that you argue for the point that you couldn't do it unless you...
No. What I'm saying is it enough simply to have intellectual smarts? Or do they have to learn from experience? Burke was absolutely amazed that the people leading the French Revolution believed that all they needed was abstract ideas. Let the people prevail. I mean, we can open all the jails. Why can you do that? Because there's no such thing as a bad man. Rousseau has taught us that. There are only bad people who put them in jail. So let them out and they will regain their natural goodness. Of course, when they did that, they kind of proved that they should have been in jail in the first place because they went right back to doing the stuff that got them in trouble to begin with. So, I mean, there was all kinds of assumptions about human nature, about the nature of power, everything like that these guys thought, we are really smart. Yeah, but you've never actually tried to put those ideals into practice. So it was, for example, that the leaders of the French Revolution invented this complete new religion to replace Catholicism, the festival of the Supreme Being. There, you see, we have invented a new religion that satisfies your emotional needs, but without all that superstitious rubbish, all these saints cults and everything like that. And, well, all the bishops and cardinals, they're all absentee. This is a religion that will satisfy you, but without superstition. So there is the temple of reason. Go in, and there's busts of Rousseau, vice, folly, and virtue. Of course, guess what the reaction of rural peasants would be to something like this. This is, pardon me?
Yeah, you can do it.
Actually, they just, whore. What the hell is this? Festival of the Supreme Being. Look, sorry.